What would you do? If you lost everything overnight, your job, your future, your dignity, and then a dead millionaire gave you just 30 days to change your life forever. This is the story of Ethan Cole, a 27-year-old man who discovered that wealth is not built with luck. It is built with pain, discipline, humiliation, and the refusal to stay broken forever. Before we begin, subscribe to the channel. Because stories like this are not just entertainment. Sometimes, they become the reason someone decides not to give up. Ethan Cole was 27 years old and already exhausted by life. Every morning he woke up staring at the same crack in the ceiling of his tiny apartment. That crack had become familiar, like poverty itself. The apartment smelled like old paint, cheap detergent, and exhaustion. The heater barely worked. The kitchen light flickered constantly. And every month Ethan wondered how much longer he could survive there. 3 blocks away he worked long hours inside a struggling print shop. The machines were old. The owner looked tired all the time. And everyone inside the building moved like people who had already accepted defeat. The pay barely covered rent. Barely helped his younger sister pay hospital bills. Barely allowed him to send money to his mother living 3 hours away. Still, Ethan kept going. Because stopping was a luxury poor people could not afford. Every day he watched people his age living completely different lives. Young professionals in suits, couples eating expensive dinners, people laughing freely without calculating prices in their heads. Meanwhile, Ethan counted every dollar, every gallon of gas, every grocery item, every unpaid bill, and slowly life began crushing him from the inside. Then one afternoon, everything collapsed. The owner of the print shop called Ethan into his office. The old man looked embarrassed. He could barely make eye contact. Finally, he sighed heavily and said, "We're shutting down." No dramatic speech, no emotional goodbye, just silence. Ethan nodded slowly, picked up his backpack, and walked out the door. Outside, the city kept moving. Cars filled the streets. People laughed in cafes. Music played from open restaurants. The world did not care that his life had just fallen apart. Ethan walked home alone through crowded sidewalks, feeling completely invisible. That night, he climbed the stairs to his apartment expecting nothing except darkness. But when he opened the door, he noticed an envelope lying on the floor. Old paper, no stamp, no return address. Across the front, written carefully in black ink, were the words, "For whoever needs this most." Inside the envelope was a handwritten letter. At the bottom was a signature, Victor Langston, a millionaire businessman who had died several months earlier. Ethan had never heard the name before, but the letter changed everything. Victor explained that years ago, before becoming successful, he had once stood exactly where Ethan stood now. Broke, invisible, one step away from giving up. Victor wrote that success did not begin the day he made money. It began the day he stopped seeing himself as powerless. Before his death, Victor decided to leave behind something more valuable than inheritance: a network of business contacts, an abandoned warehouse, and one final opportunity for someone who still refused to quit. At the end of the letter, there was an address, and one sentence written separately from the rest. Opportunity only matters if you are willing to suffer for it. The next morning, Ethan traveled across the city to the warehouse address. The building looked abandoned. Broken windows, rust stains, dust everywhere. For a moment, he thought the entire thing was a joke. Then the front door opened. A man in his 50s stepped outside. Salt and pepper hair, navy suit, calm expression. "My name is Marcus," he said. "I worked for Victor Langston." Marcus studied Ethan carefully, not with judgment, but with curiosity. Finally, he handed Ethan a key. "You have 30 days," Marcus said quietly. 30 days to prove you can build something real. Ethan almost laughed. He had no experience, no investors, no business education, no confidence. But for the first time in years, someone believed he might become more than his circumstances. The first week was brutal. Suppliers doubted him immediately. Some ignored his calls. Others treated him like a child pretending to be important. Every meeting felt humiliating. One supplier looked Ethan up and down and asked, "So what exactly qualifies you to be here?" The room became silent. Ethan felt heat rise into his face. He wanted to lie, wanted to sound confident, wanted to pretend he knew everything. But then he remembered something Victor had written on the side of an old contract. Never pretend to know more than you truly understand. So Ethan told the truth. "No," he admitted quietly. "I don't know everything yet." The supplier smirked slightly, but Ethan continued, "What I do know is that I will outwork anyone in this room." Silence. Then something changed. The tension disappeared. Not completely, but enough. People stopped seeing arrogance and started seeing honesty. A distributor named Heine Lawson eventually gave Ethan a small trial order. It wasn't large, it wasn't glamorous. But to Ethan, it felt like oxygen. For the first time, someone had given him a chance. Ethan attacked the opportunity with everything he had. He barely slept, barely ate, barely went home. He negotiated shipments himself, moved inventory with bleeding hands, packed boxes alone inside the freezing warehouse. Every muscle in his body hurt. But he refused to stop. At night he sat alone at a folding table surrounded by paperwork, trying desperately to understand business terms he had never heard before. Some nights he felt stupid, completely unqualified, like he was pretending to belong in a world that would eventually reject him. But every time those thoughts appeared, he kept working, and somehow he completed the first order in 4 days. When Heine received the shipment, she called Ethan directly. "You actually did it," she said. For the first time in weeks, Ethan smiled. Not because he had become successful, but because he finally felt useful again. Success came with a cost. By the second week, pressure started crushing him. Bills piled up again. Suppliers demanded faster payments. Customers wanted impossible deadlines, and exhaustion slowly destroyed his body. Late one night, Ethan collapsed alone on the dusty warehouse floor. Above him, an old fluorescent light flickered endlessly. The silence felt unbearable. For the first time in years, Ethan cried, not loudly, not dramatically, just quietly, like a man too tired to keep carrying everything alone. In that moment, all the fear returned. What if he failed? What if everyone was right? What if poverty was all his life would ever become? He thought about his mother, his sister, the cracked ceiling in his apartment, and for one dangerous moment, he wanted to quit. Then another thought appeared. If he stopped now, nothing would change. The pain would still exist. The bills would still exist. The regret would still exist. Slowly, Ethan forced himself back to his feet. He walked to the sink, splashed freezing water across his face, looked into the mirror, and whispered quietly, "Keep moving." Then he returned to work. Something changed during the third week. People started talking about Ethan. Suppliers who once ignored him now returned his calls immediately. Small business owners respected his discipline. Even investors started noticing his honesty. One afternoon, Marcus introduced Ethan to an older investor who had once worked closely with Victor Langston. The man leaned back in his chair and asked quietly, "What happens if 30 days pass and you still fail?" Ethan thought carefully, then answered honestly, "Then I keep moving. Stopping has never solved anything." The investor stared at him for several seconds, because for the first time, Ethan truly believed those words himself. That same week, another supplier agreement was signed, then another. Momentum finally appeared. Not luck, not magic. Momentum, built through pain, discipline, and consistency. The warehouse slowly transformed. Boxes filled the floor, whiteboards covered the walls, phones rang constantly. The empty building no longer looked abandoned, it looked alive. And for the first time in years, Ethan felt alive too. Day 30 finally arrived. Ethan stood quietly inside the warehouse, looking around in disbelief. 30 days earlier, the building had been empty. Now it was filled with inventory, contracts, shipping schedules, and opportunity. 3 supplier agreements had already been signed, customers were returning, new meetings were scheduled. Ethan still wasn't rich, not even close. But he had built something far more important: momentum, structure, a foundation, the architecture of wealth. That night he called his mother. She asked him the same question she always asked. "When are you coming home?" This time Ethan smiled quietly. "Soon," he whispered. But now, it no longer sounded like an apology. It sounded like a promise. Because Ethan finally understood something most people never realize. Success is not built in one dramatic moment. It is built quietly, painfully, repeatedly. One decision at a time, one sacrifice at a time, one difficult day at a time. And sometimes, the walls trapping your future were built by your own fear, which means you also have the power to tear them down. Most people think wealth begins with money, but it doesn't. Wealth begins the moment you stop believing your current situation is permanent. Ethan did not become successful overnight. He simply refused to stay broken forever. And sometimes, that is where transformation truly begins. If this story inspired you, leave a comment below. I will keep moving. And remember this: your life can change faster than you think, but only if you refuse to quit.
If this story inspired you, subscribe to Brutal Truth Animated. New cinematic stories every week about discipline, growth, and real change.